All right, it's time for us to kind of get started. Hello, everyone. I am Almas Maskatwala, and it is my absolute joy to welcome each one of you to the fourth session of the Faiths in Conversation series. As I always do, I like to first and foremost thank Dr. Ali Asghar Ali Bhai, who's the Assistant Professor of Art History at UT Dallas, and Dr. Niels Romer, Dean of the Harry W. Bass Junior School of the Arts, Humanities, and Technology, for hosting this series virtually. And Dr. Ali Bhai, I deeply appreciate your leadership in making this a reality. So thank you so much. I want to kind of briefly talk about this entire series, an overview on the series. So the Faiths in Conversation initiative began in 2012 with three faith leaders representing three Abrahamic traditions with the goal of engaging in dialogue across different religious centers, rotating between a synagogue, mosque, and church. This model was successfully led by Dr. Robert Hunt of SMU until 2018. In 2019, I was serving as the chair of the Interfaith Council of the Thanksgiving Foundation, and I felt a strong need to revive the series, expanding its scope to include both Eastern and Western traditions and cultures. Since then, these sessions held in person and via Zoom have explored themes like the role of intellect, faith and justice, environmental stewardship, and the relationship between faith and society from Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Native Americans, Zoroastrians, Buddhist, and Shinto traditions. The essence of this series continues to highlight religion and culture as community affairs, not merely private practices. Religious communities and their cultural expressions exist in relationship with the broader society to which they belong. The vision of this project is to educate objectively and inspire everyone to embrace the diversity in our communities with an attitude of pluralism and cosmopolitan ethics. Here, I would like to quote His Highness the Aga Khan, my spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslim community, whose words and work have inspired this series for me. He says, I believe that the coexistence of these two surging impulses, what one might call a new globalism on one hand and a new tribalism on the other, with a central challenge for educational leaders in the years ahead. And this will be particularly true in the developing world with its combinations of different identities. He continues to say, as we work together to bridge the gulf between the East and West, between North and South, between developing and developed economies, between urban and rural settings, we will be redefining what it means to be well educated. He continues, together we can help reshape the very definition of a well-educated global citizen. And we can begin that process by bridging the gap which lies at the heart of what some have called a clash of civilizations, but which I have always felt was rather a clash of ignorances, he said. Our series is aspiring to bridge the gaps of misunderstandings with the ethos of pluralism, inclusivity, learning, and conversation. This year's Faith in Conversation series is themed around sacred places. We are thrilled to introduce our fourth session featuring Dr. Neta Bodner. We will be introducing her shortly. I just kind of want to briefly cover the flow of the session. Following Dr. Neta Bodner's presentation, Dr. Ali Bhai will moderate the audience question answer segment. Please use the chat feature to submit questions and comments, and our moderator will facilitate the discussion. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ali Bhai to introduce our esteemed speaker. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you. Good morning to some of you on the West Coast, and good evening to many of you that are across the Atlantic or even further. Welcome to the Harry W. Bass Jr. School of Arts, Humanities, and Technology here at the University of Texas at Dallas. We would all like to warmly invite you all to our series on faiths and cultures in conversation. And I would also like to take a moment to thank Almas Muscatwala, who is a light in our Dallas community, for bringing this program here. Today, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Neta Bodner, who is an art historian whose research focuses on medieval art and especially architecture. And as someone who's basically medieval Islamic art, but especially architecture, that makes me quite happy. Her work concentrates on Jewish and Christian religious buildings in the Romanesque and Gothic styles from Germany, Northern Italy, and France. Since 2020, she holds a position as a lecturer at the Open University of Israel in the Department of Literature, Languages, and the Arts. Her current project is a monograph on the Jewish ritual bath, the mikvaot, from Ashkenaz and their intersections with the Christian Romanesque. Dr. Bodner was a postdoctoral fellow in the ERC-funded project Beyond the Elite, Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Europe, headed by Professor Elisheva Baumgarten at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And currently, Dr. Neta Bodner is the PI of an Israeli Science Foundation project on the mikveh of Köln, in collaboration with scholars at Bar Ilan in Cologne, and of a DHSS Hub project on VR experiences in medieval architecture. And I would also like to say that I met Dr. Bodner in Germany last year in September, and I am also very happy to say that not only do we have similar interests in our obsession and academic endeavor in the medieval world, but I'm very happy to call her a friend as well. Today, she's going to use the power of water to enlighten all of us with her talk titled Purification of the Soul on Water, Spiritual Renewal, and the Architecture of Medieval Mikvaot and Baptisteries. Before I give the floor to Dr. Bodner, I would like everyone to, if you are going to ask a question, please do it in the Q&A section. If you go to more, you'll see a Q&A box. So please place your questions there. We'll hold them till the end of the session. And if you do want to open your camera, feel free to open your camera, but please make sure that you are muted. So again, thank you once again, Dr. Bodner, for joining us, and welcome to the University of Texas at Dallas.
Thank you so much for your friendship, first of all, for your introduction and for the invitation. I was so overwhelmed and touched to be talking to you before the Zoom, to both you and to Almas, and to hear about everything that you're doing and to hear this amazing introduction. I feel it's such a shame that I'm here for my own lecture rather than to be listening to other people's presentations on this amazingly important and such a timely project. I wish I could learn more from you, and I hope that I can join some of your talks in the future. So it's a little hard to begin talking about purification of the soul. It's a time in which interfaith and to have cultures and conversations is such a huge thing. I feel a conversation only about kind of the Jewish spiritual renewal within the architecture of the medieval mikvaot that I work on doesn't touch upon anything important enough. So I've tried to broaden the scope a little bit. So I'll tell you a little bit about my project and also see if I can zoom out or hover over other points which could be of interest, which I hope will be of interest. But first, let's kind of immerse ourselves in some of the images and take it from there. So the perspective I want to talk about today is about how water animates a building. Let me move the little zoom thing so I can see the words I put in the slides, about how water can animate a building and how water can serve as a meeting point between ceremony space and users. Because I've been immersed in a project on Jewish ritual baths, and much of the focus of the great work that's been done on them has been about the buildings and less so about the ceremonies. And so amazing work on Jewish ceremonies in the Middle Ages has not taken into consideration the buildings. Most interesting is that the act itself of immersion or submersion, which I'll explain all about in a moment, hasn't been central to discussion of either. Neither the buildings themselves, nor actually about the rules of purification in Judaism in the Middle Ages or otherwise. For me, as a person who's always liked not just looking at buildings, but walking within buildings, touching the walls of buildings, putting my feet in the water of buildings which have that in them, I've been drawn to looking at the experiential aspects which lie at the heart of some of the of religious ceremonies at large, which try to kind of mediate between the individual, the group, the space, the transcendental, and the specific time. My project is about 4 Jewish ritual baths. So Jewish ritual baths are buildings built around water pools of water that hasn't been collected through human effort. So there are different ways to make water arrive at the bottom of the pool without drawing it, without today opening a tap, but having the water run there naturally or replenish itself from under the ground from springs in order to be water that was collected without human effort. Has a lot of rules about the mass of water, about the type of materials the water can come into contact with, about certain criteria which can make the water unfit for purification. So there's a whole tractate of the Mishnah, which explains how the water collection can be done in a way which makes them fit. And those rules are quite straightforward, and they haven't changed much since being penned first or second, some of it in the 3rd century AD. But in a certain point in time, around the 12th and the 13th centuries, there are some examples of buildings which are monumental much beyond the requirements, the technical religious requirements of how the water should be collected or about how these Jewish ritual baths should be built. And for me, that was interesting. I wanted to understand why a space would be built in a way which was superfluous from a religious legal point of view, but which resulted in quite an amazing architectural achievement from an experiential, from an architectural point of view. So to bridge those two divides was quite interesting to me. And as an architectural historian, of course, the underlying question would be why they would appear at a certain place at a certain time, why they're characteristic of only 2 centuries in Latin Europe, and are larger, more monumental, differently conceived and differently used than Jewish ritual baths before or after, ever before or ever after in any other place or time. So naturally, those questions would ask about the ceremonies. Were the ceremonies happening in the same way? About the rules. Were they understanding the rules of purification in the same way as other times and places? And about the ideals of the community that were encapsulated in both the ceremony and the spaces designed for them. So I work on 4 Jewish ritual baths. And I really want to talk to you a little bit about how I decided to organize the book, which I've just completed about them. But I don't want to lose sight of the question, which is maybe interesting to you guys, though being broader than the project, which is about water and purification. So I'm going to detour. I'm going to start with kind of bigger conversation about how I want to look at water and maybe get us kind of interested in the different questions that we can ask about architecture, which has water at its center, and then go back to my project. But I wanted you to know where this comes from. If any of you have heard me talk before, you may be familiar with some of the images of the Jewish ritual baths. It's been an ongoing project because I felt that talking about these issues and trying to uncover a way of doing the work itself and then organizing it into a book really touched upon questions which lie at the heart of community, of ideals of how what purification is, how purification should occur, intercultural entanglement with surrounding Christian society and how they were thinking about some of the same things, technology, hydraulic elements. And so I've been running with this for a while. Let's zoom out a little bit, okay? So as a medievalist, it's easy to think about a building as representative of a community. But as I was preparing the talk for today and thinking about kind of my favorite buildings which have water in and around them, I was reading this online and just want to read it out to you. Architecture is an integral part of our daily lives. Not only does it provide us with spaces to live, but it also enriches our spirit and cultural heritage. Sometimes a building can represent an entire nation. National Assembly of Bangladesh is an eloquent example of this. The reason I liked it, except liking any building by Louis I. Khan, the architect, and liking the National Assembly of Bangladesh in particular, is a lot of what I've been thinking about in the buildings that I work on in Latin Europe, in the ways of how the buildings represent their communities and how the communities choose to represent themselves through their buildings. So that was just an aside. Here you can see the way that the water is used around the building. Taking photographs from different parts of this building, the two photographs at the bottom, the right one kind of shows how it works, but not from an embodied human perspective, right? No one can reach that perspective from their own 2 feet. And then on the left, how the water moves and changes with the changing weather, and how the building changes with it. The building doesn't really change, but the perception of the building is animated by the changing water around it. So using water around the building, at the base of the building, is something which gives a wider perspective from which to look at the building, but it also means that the building, the changes of the perception of the building with the weather are amplified. It's also a way, and you can see here in the Kimball Art Museum, which I think isn't very far from you guys, is it? How far is it from you?
Maybe 25 minutes for me from Plano, but then people who are in Dallas, other places, probably the distance would differ, but it's not too far. You're right.
Good. Well, you guys are very, very lucky. I was there once. I was at a conference in New Orleans, and I made sure to have a stopover at Fort Worth in order to see this and 3 other buildings in the same complex.
I am 3 hours away.
You're 3 hours away?
Yes,
And do you go there ever?
of course. With my students, I went as well.
Oh, your students are very, very, very lucky. So I went to see this in the 3 other buildings that are there. Oh, sorry, by Tadeo Anto and building by Philip Johnson. And I just choose this example in order to show again how water is used outside these buildings, but in a way which doesn't foster interaction. So no one is coming for the water. No one is really interacting with the water, not touching the water, but the water facilitates the ideal of having the architecture be the meeting between silence and light. And the water is a surrounding material which has its own life, it has its own reflections, it has its own material quality, it reacts differently to the changing environmental conditions, and it reflects back upon the building, and it's a strong facilitator of the silence and the light that's an ideal for Louis Kahn in his architecture. So I was Googling your university, and I understand that you also have some of these dynamics around your university. One of the things which are interesting for me is water which doesn't have any mechanical movement, and water that does. I saw here that you have these little fountains which give the water its own animation beyond the environmental condition. And I wonder how you feel with that in the way that the water is used. But again, here the water isn't used as a material for people to be interacting with, but maybe it's rather a visual element, an aesthetic element, an experiential element, maybe a sensual element, which is intended to do something, but it's not something which people are meant to interact with within the building. This is another Louis Kahn example to show that the cases in which the water is a moving element within the static architectural composition. I'm going to go back to the concept of living waters, but one of the things which often happens in works of architecture which have water at their center is that the water introduces the element of movement. It also has the sound of movement. And this is something which contrasts with the building, but again, isn't intended for human interaction. So of course, none of this begins with Louis Kahn in the 1970s. There are so many examples. I just took my pick of ones which are my favorite. And I wanted to show that on the one hand, the water gives a very strong axis and perspective. And of course, it also gives the reflection. In the case of the Taj Mahal, it also comes from two directions. And you have here the contrast between water, which has been very strongly orchestrated or curated on the one side, and the water, which is the natural body of water on the other. And neither of them can be seen at the same time. Here in Jerusalem, we have something which used to be similar. This is the church of Saint Anne in the Bethesda pool right next to it, and a reconstruction. Unfortunately, I only have the reconstruction from the wrong direction. It's not in the same direction in which the photograph was taken, but maybe if we look at this photograph, you can see another direction. You can have maybe a better idea. You can imagine these cisterns with the plaster filled with water. You can imagine the cisterns all around the Byzantine church, and having the church look as if it's kind of rising up from the water. As the building is integrated within the pool, which is the story which the sacred site is meant to commemorate. So the site is a site which commemorates the Bethesda pool miracle of Christ, and the church was built coming out of the waters, or it looks as if it's coming out of the water. It's flooded around with water, and the water, so it's part of the narrative, but it's also part of the experience. Mostly, as we saw with the water, which was flat, it's part of the way that the building is seen from afar, and part of the way in which the building is reflected within the waters, but also it creates the other sensual experiences, not very different from everything which we've seen. We see again this flat use of water at Alhambra, and also I hope you can see the difference between the situations in which the water is mechanically manipulated in order to move in a way which isn't environmental, also from the Alhambra. Here we have another example from Jerusalem, and this is the earlier rendition of the cast on the Haram al-Sharif. And here we introduce a new theme, okay? Because water with which the people who are coming to a site are meant to interact, I think we need to talk about it as a different story. And here, this is the point that I've kind of been pushing towards with these first slides, to make a differentiation between water which is aesthetic and which is meant to amplify the building without being part of the visitor experience, and water which is intended to serve as a ritual purpose and with which people are meant to come into direct contact. And I think putting the people within the water as part of the visit, it introduces a difference between spectators and participants, between people who maybe have water as an element which changes their pace or their viewing patterns or their phenomenological experience of coming to a building, or people who are interacting with the water in order to reach a spiritual goal. The spiritual goal can be preparatory, so to purify before entering a site in order to carry out liturgy. It can be otherwise. And I think it's a different situation. And I think it's a different situation which maybe uses some of the same characteristics of water, but it needs to be taken into consideration. And the thing is, usually when we arrive at a site which is historical. And when we look at visualizations of the sites, this element is either fully lacking or needs a lot of concentration in order to be reconstructed in our mind's eye. So if you look here at the contemporary image of the cast, you can see the chairs, and you can see the taps, but it also demands a lot of concentration in order to see the place kind of alive with people. And for me, in the buildings that I work on, the living waters are the metaphor which is used by the Hebrew sources in order to describe the water in the Jewish ritual baths that I work on. But it's not only the living waters, it's the interaction between the people and the living waters which reaches the ideal of purification for which the buildings were made. And I think this is something that, for me, I have to kind of work very hard in order to make that a part of my research process, and also to keep it in mind, because I think the way that space is visualized really influences the questions that can be asked and the answers which can be reached. So this is just to have like some comic relief, okay? This is a suggestion. This is one of the suggestions after the fire at Notre Dame in Paris. They suggested, they had a competition for different people to suggest how they could fix the roof. And this was one of the suggestions. And apart from being, you know, a cool idea, a funny thing to look at, something which can give us a bit of kind of a breather in the middle of a talk. Apart from being something which, you know, can't be realized in reality, I think it gives a moment to really think about the fact that not all water within architecture was created the same, and water within which people are intended to come into contact is a different type of water, and it changes the way that we can think about the functionality of the building. I think one of the interesting things which came up with all of the different suggestions for the rebuilding of the Notre Dame Cathedral was that they all, to an extent, wanted to have a meeting between the medieval building whose roof was destroyed. It was actually an early modern roof, but whose roof was destroyed, and to have it visually bridged with the contemporary era. Also with the question of what the cathedral means to the people of Paris today, you know, because you can look at this pool on the roof and you can look at it as something which is just kind of a cool idea of what to do in the middle of the city, but you can also think about it, about at least one artist's reflection of what the cathedral is in the center of Paris, and how people, what a contemporary cathedral is to the people who now see it not only as heritage, but as something that wants to be updated. So going back to my project, I wanted to see whether I can think about where the water comes from to the buildings that I work on and how it's used. So here it's a plan in a section which my colleague Moria Ehrman made of the city church in the city of Friedberg and the mikveh, not in the way that they're geographically located. They have about 3 streets between them, but one is an overground structure, the other is an underground structure. So you can see the ground line between them. You can see the difference in scale, but also the depth of 25 meters, which the Friedberg Jewish ritual bath reaches. And we try to give a sense of the dynamics of underground spring water that comes from the aquifer, and to reflect what I see in the Hebrew sources, which is the way that they think about water and the different places it comes from. So obviously the tap is irrelevant, right? If I'm working on the 12th century, or here in this case, the 13th century. But a lot of the Hebrew sources which I work on continue the question of where the water comes from and how it can arrive and what makes it able to purify. And the highest grade of water for purification is water which comes directly from the aquifer, so spring water, which is in the meeting points between softer and harder stones. And it can be found quite easily when digging under the ground in Germany, especially in cities which have rivers. Those types of kind of representations which are making try to bear in mind that having visualizations which don't include people and which don't include some vivacity of the water don't tell the full picture of either of the community's liturgical ideals. So here you can see a stone baptismal font in St. Georg in Köln, in Cologne. You can see today it's closed unless it's being used. And it's really hard to get a sense of the functioning of the building without really stopping and thinking about it. To the right, you can see the Köln mikveh, here in a very low water situation, with some reconstructed stairwells built after a first excavation, but also with some medieval stairwells that you can see here at the bottom. And it's really hard to understand the scale of the water that's coming out here. In a second, you're going to see it with people and be easier to understand. So going back to my project, I found myself trying to look at the four deepest, most monumentally built Jewish ritual baths from the end of the 12th century till the middle of the 13th century. And I had so many things to examine about each of them. And at the end of the work, I said to myself, okay, how do I talk about all the different things that are going on here? So what I decided to do was to organize the book in chronological order, beginning with the Jewish ritual bath of Köln, which was built sometime after the middle of the 12th century. Then the Jewish ritual bath of Worms, which was built in 1185-6. Then the ritual bath of Speyer, which was built in circa 1200. And then the ritual bath of Friedberg, which was built in 1260. And following the chronological order was really, really important because of the technology that moved forward between each of the buildings and the work with the masonry and with stones and the ability to find the water and use the water pools. But then I wanted to see what the topics come out for each chapter. And here I wanted to be led by the sources. So I had sources within Köln talking about the water, rabbinic sources talking about how the water came into the building. And so that was the chapter that I began with. It's the earliest chronologically, and it's about the water. It's at the base of the Jewish ritual bath. It's at the base of the ceremony. It's where everything begins conceptually. And also this earliest Jewish ritual bath was the one that I had Hebrew sources talking about the water. And the things that interested them was about how the waters were living waters, which was very cool because it's also what's interesting to me. And I gave you the sense how I think about water to be an element which is animating in the building and the meeting point between people and the building itself. And the next chapter is about Worms, which was about stone, because there are inscriptions from the Worms mikveh and from the Worms synagogue, which talk about the achievement of building in masonry, which is such a huge thing. In the 11th and 12th century, it's a revolution. So the stone revolution is reflected also in the Hebrew sources. It's not something which is only happening on a technological level, but it's something that the Hebrew sources, the poetry that's being written upon these buildings in Worms is celebrating their work with stone. It's using metaphors to do with stone about things which are long lasting, about things which connect to the past, stones which were there before the buildings and are going to stay there after, about the act of writing in a metal stylus, words for a community to read over generations. And so you have the way that the community is expressing its ideals within the metaphors of the materials which they're working with. And then the chapter about Speyer looks at light. This is a building which is naturally lit underground, and it's also a city within which we have Jewish theologians which were working on the idea of why people purify, how they should purify, and what the purification is meant to achieve. And they're expanding the already substantiated categories of purification, which are biblical categories of purification, to include other more conceptual purifications, for example, purification from sin, for example, purification after rupture, and using the transformative power of water together with the experiential elements of light as a metaphor for God, in order to think about how these buildings and the purification acts which are working within them are meant to help people overcome the inherent ruptures of life and to give them a process through which to have repentance for sin and to go back to cleaning their spirits as they clean their bodies within the Jewish ritual bath. Then the final chapter is about community, but sadly I've looked at the clock and I see how I have to I have to push forward so that we see the entire presentation. Okay, the last chapter isn't very interesting. We're going to begin we're talking about the beginning of the book. So the only thing that we're talking about today is the water. But the water, as you've already understood from what I was saying, is part of a table of contents of all of the circles of ideals, which I think are reflected in the Jewish ritual bath. So the water connects to the way that the architecture is designed around it. Here you can see the shaft over the Köln water pool, and you can imagine, I've taken the photo from the water pool looking upwards to what used to be, I think, an oculus with the light above. So the water and framing of the water is what leads the architecture. The movement of the people to the water, because the water is so deep within the structures that axes is a huge part of the purification process. The light, because in all of them there's natural light which accompanies the purification within the water, and the natural light is channeled so that it touches the naked body as it goes into the natural water that wells from below. And the issue of the ceremony, these two things happening at the same time, and a very, very, very intimate ceremony. So it's not very usual in public monuments. Kind of began by looking by kind of a very, just a general spectrum of buildings that I like that have water in them. The point really was that having water within a building doesn't mean that they're similar in any way. And having a building which is designed for an intimate ceremony where individuals one by one go without any clothes at all into the water with full submersion in order to reach purification at very set times and for very set reasons is a whole different thing than the types of buildings where the water is used for visual enhancement, as we saw in the buildings before. And then the issue of the experience, which is the harder one to get at from the medieval sources. Then this would be a methodological question, which I can put to you. How do you work on something which is clearly achieved by the architectural design, but which the sources are really they are really silent about? So can we talk about experience when the sources don't articulate this element, but which is something which is clearly found in the design of the building? And how can we talk about it in a way which is really reflective of the theological points of views of the rabbis if they didn't write it, or from the perspective of the users if we can't reach them? So let's look at Köln, so the chapter on water. The building goes down 16 meters underground, and it's a combination of a descent in an exterior stairwell. So exterior not because it's above ground, but outside of the shaft, which you're seeing here. So dug in between the earth and an interior wall, masonry wall, and then goes down to the building here. There are windows which peek down onto the water pool, but don't give you a full vantage point until you're standing right over the water after having derobed in this little niche here, which is in between the earth and the masonry wall. And then this internal stairwell pivots into the shaft itself and over the water pool. It's very hard to understand the building from the plans and the sections. So in collaboration with the scholars, with archaeologists working in Köln, we made a set of photogrammetry models so that the building could be easier to understand, can be turned around. So really an amazing model, apart from this one made by Ertan Özkan, there's an amazing model made by Julia Lim, but it's such good quality that no computer except the one that she has can actually show it at this point in time. So until we overcome that, we'll see this model, which isn't complete, but she's made a photogrammetry model of all the parts with a drone. It can now also be experienced in VR. So next time we meet, when I'm physically in Dallas and where you guys are physically where I am, then we can wear Oculus headsets and walk within the building, which makes such a difference when you're thinking about space. It's very, very cool. And it's actually really, really important to get a sense of how the spaces work one with the other. One thing that you can see here is that the water fluctuates to quite a great extent. And Michael Wien, who's the archaeologist working there, and we're in a collaborative project, has made measured the water levels, and they fluctuate a lot throughout the year. So one of the things that happens with this Jewish ideal of working with non-drawn water is that it's always dependent on environmental conditions. So one of the definitions under which the water is living is that it either bubbles up from the ground according to the true environmental conditions, or it falls down in collected rainfall according to the true environmental conditions. So it's one of the elements, one of many elements within a Jewish culture, which is dependent on the seasons and dependent on environmental conditions, and something which is a means of not only using a natural material within a building, but allowing it to keep some of its natural characteristics despite being used within a man-made building. This is a photograph from summer 2024, and I don't know if you noticed the difference in water height. So here you can see when we made the photograph, when Erten made the photogrammetry model, there was about 60 millimeters of water, and here there are about 4.5 meters of water. So it fluctuates to a great extent. But looking at the fluctuations, you can understand details of the building. For example, this niche for placing clothes and this niche for placing flame illumination now make actually quite a lot more sense when the water comes all the way up here in this year, which has been very, very rainy. One of the Hebrew sources about this site explains the difference between rainwater and spring water. The Jewish the rabbis draw different mental maps of water coming from different places and water undergoing different circumstances, the difference between water which has been taken out of its natural body, water which remains in its natural body, water which continues flowing from the aqueduct, which has been stopped and then continues on, and each one has a different category, making it fit or unfit for different purification. About the mikveh of Köln, you've seen here, this is the Hebrew word kolonia. So it's giving an example of what a spring is, and spring is the highest type of purification. And it says if a spring stops a little, like the one in Cologne, which sometimes stops a little, then you can add drawn water to it because it's the highest type of purification. It never becomes devaluated by the addition of drawn water, because the concept is that underground water, spring water, is always fully connected to all the other underground bodies of water, that you're seeing just the tip of this water iceberg, in which case immersing within this water means that you're at that moment touching all the underground waters, which means it always has a full volume. So I'm giving you kind of a bit of this quote to show you that even with the very, very, very dry legal rabbinic descriptions of a very on the ground situation. Okay, if your mikveh stops a little, your Jewish ritual bath stops a little, now it's inusable, like the 60 centimeters which we saw in the Köln mikveh. If you're using spring waters, at that moment you're touching all the waters underground, which means it always has a full volume, and you can add drawn water and you can use it. It's kind of on the meeting point between something which is completely technical, but it's also this little small perspective on the conceptualization of what's actually happening when you're getting there into that spring water. You're touching all that water of a world not yet created, which is the language used in a different rabbinic source, which talks about the rules behind purification. So even if we can't reach the issue of experience, we have some of these small hints to what the symbolism behind spring water, living waters, metaphors of living waters which are equated with God, metaphors of the spring is connecting to a world not yet created, which gives some sort of sense of then different rabbinic sources which explain why this water could be transformative. What are the situations in which this water can pass a person from a situation of being impure in body and soul, and then moving to a transformation into a new state, which is a new beginning, which is something which puts behind either their sins or the state of impurity for different reasons. But they really have to be drawn out very carefully. As I said, I always worry about talking about experiential aspects without having the sources. But then I say to myself, okay, I'm going to try and have visualizations, which gives something of the experiential aspect, and I see what I can look at it, which can be characteristics which are analyzed within the architecture. So just to make sure I'm not making it up. So this Yuli Ale made with a drone in Köln, and you can see the air from the drone. What you're seeing reflected is the drone itself that's reflecting in the water, and gives you a sense, even just with that air movement, of how the space changes and how the water changes and how the building gets animated. And it allows you to look at something of the distance and something of the axes, and it's something of the oh, sorry, did someone want to ask something? No? Okay. And it's something of the parts of the building which actually should be considered. One of the things which Julia did here is to take these photographs with minimal artificial lighting. You can see this very, very strong LED lighting within the banister, but she also has opened up the planks closed above what probably used to be an oculus in order to give natural lighting. And then you can see how the movement, the stone, and the water work together within the building. And of course, it's part of the design. A building which is designed around a movement axis and which always changes perspective needs to be thought about also in these terms, because it was built for the ceremony. It wasn't built just to be looked at as two-dimensional. So wrapping up, I've touched on several things. One of the things I've touched upon is about architectural representation. But on the one hand, having the necessity to understand the buildings, in which case we have to make plans, we have to make sections, we have to make 3D models. All the representations which you've seen here, I've made with my friend and colleague Moria Ehrman. But also, as soon as we finished this model of Speyer, we also had to look back and say, okay, these are great for understanding so many elements of the building, but they're lacking for understanding something which is so inherent in religious architecture, which is the way that it fosters transformation, identity, community, experience, in which the ceremonies play out on a sense level, and which can't be captured within these types of representations. So alongside of them, which I do all sorts of animations. We've been working with gaming programs because they're very good at it. They're very good at the issues of movement. They're very good at the issue of embodied perspective. So letting the person who's viewing look from two eyes of a human subjective embodied point of view and then move within and around their space. They're good at letting water and other ephemeral elements be represented within the architectural representation. And we found these things within a world of liturgy, if I'm trying to look at liturgy and architecture together, to be useful. We played around with some gaming from the Köln mikveh. We'll get back to you on that. And also when we meet physically, we can all meet within the Oculus headsets and do our game within the Köln mikveh and see how it's different when you move within the game. But the idea would be to have the photogrammetry models which are being made as also 3D databases within which some of the written sources can be read as the space is being experienced, to have the things together and to have the water represented as high, represented as low, and to have the perspective, an anthropologist perspective, like what we saw from the photogrammetry model from outside, so that you can look at it like a doll's house, but also to have an embodied perspective where you can walk virtually through the building. The thing is, it all has to go hand in hand. On the one hand, to go as deeply into the water as possible, to touch the water, to touch the building, to work with the archaeologist, to work with the manuscripts, to see everything as closely and as real as possible, but also to see whether we can use, these are some of the programs which we're working on to do these post-production layers upon the models, to see what elements of that can also be represented as we talk about the buildings and something other than narrative, other than the words, to do the 3D modeling with the SketchUp, Blender, reality capture onto the photogrammetry models in order to have these dynamic elements, which I've been working hard to try and explain, be represented within the building. This doesn't mean that I'm putting aside the sources. Absolutely not. I'm going to try and read every source possible about the conceptions of contemporaries. This is again a source about the mikveh in Köln, to understand how they were working with the water. This is a source about cleaning the mikveh, with the problem about the water and trying to get the spring to stop seeping. It doesn't mean to stop looking at the buildings. So one of the things that I feel needs to be done with the water is to be able not to just look at it from the side. If you're walking down this axis with all these stairwells, you can't end a second before you've done what the building has been built to do. So I was standing there with my lovely, lovely colleagues who I really appreciate so much, and I enjoy so much working with, the archaeologist at Köln. And one of my friends said, okay, so I've heard you're going to do something crazy and you're going to go into the water. I said to him, it's absolutely not crazy. It's what the building was built for. It's completely crazy not to go into the water. It's the wrong way of thinking. You can't fully think about the building without carrying out the intention for which it was built. And then you have to think about this issue of participant versus observer within the design. Because I think this is a line that needs to be drawn between different types of religious architecture, the ones in which the water is part of the observer, and where the water or different natural materials, other natural materials, are part of what changes the use of the participant. And being a participant, it's sometimes a little hard if you're trying to be a historian, but going into the participant's perspective is part of everything that needs to be done to fully animate the building. So as soon as the water moves, the building comes alive in a way which can't happen without that. It also shows the directionality, going in, going out, the way that the building functions. I'm going to stop there. I have more slides, but I want to open up for questions, unless you're happy for me to just run through the slides so that you see the other things. You tell me. Sorry, you're muted. Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Dr. Alibai, are you able to unmute? And
Yes, sorry, I'm getting old. I was pressing a whole bunch of buttons and it wasn't working. I would be very happy to see more images if you want to run through them, and then we can go to the Q&A if you're comfortable with that. I'm jumping on the edge of my seat anyways, so I can wait a little bit longer.
Okay, so I'll run through them very quickly, because I always prefer to be under time rather than over time. Okay. So more things to think about, okay? And we can go back to this in the Q&A. There are different instances of Jewish purification, and each of them uses the water in a different way. And I can talk more to the issue of Jewish perception of water as potentially living and as transformative material, and to the way that this plays out within the Hebrew sources. We can talk about Christian baptism and the way that some of the ideas about transformation, about the symbolic death and rebirth, about putting behind sin and being cleansed from sin, comes up also in, of course, also in the Christian sources, but in the way that the two traditions actually try to differentiate from each other, despite having these intersections very, very, very strongly in the High Middle Ages. To have the same questions asked about the way that baptisteries should be thought about with the water within them, and how the space can be thought about as liturgical space despite the changes it's undergone through time, and the difficulties in thinking about these spaces as liturgical spaces in their current organization, which is almost 100% water-free usually. To think if it's enough to add the water in with our mind's eye, and to know that there were sometimes infant baptism, but also so many more adult baptisms than we usually think about, even in the 12th century, when infant baptism is already substantiated, certainly in the 6th century, if we want to go back there, and to what extent this needs to be visually animated, and to research about baptisteries as well, whether it's productive or unproductive. To take stock of the fact that some of the people making new baptisteries today are trying to give a stronger sense of the water within the visual elements of the baptism fonts, trying to give a stronger sense of the lowering into the water, which is into the ground, which visually actually connects to the idea of the Jewish ritual baths, which always have to be dug into the ground. Which is also a question to ask about the way that a culture tries to, on the one hand, put a natural material within buildings, and then on the other hand, to continue having very strict laws about the volume of water and the way that it's dug into the ground in order to keep a natural sense. So the dynamics within the religion between the natural and the orchestrated, and the rules that govern it. What can we say about instances in which the scale, and this is my project, this is the final chapter about Friedberg, how the scale changed thinking about water, differences between aspersion, immersion, submersion, when thinking about the way that ceremonies are built around water, and how it makes a difference to thinking about the architecture around them, the way that light and water work together, and how these metaphors can be cross-cultural, but they can also be really, really specifically defined by the different cultural and religious traditions. The way that water is a reflective material. It's one of those things which on the one hand has its own materiality, but on the other hand is also transparent and reactive to the other materials within which it works. And this is something which was really, really, really strongly played around with in the Middle Ages. And I think would probably come in a little stronger into the study of liturgy with the water. And finally, to what, oh, I don't want to talk too much about this, but to what extent going into the water and making buildings come alive changes the way that that we can think about the architecture. How cases of making a video can be the absolutely right thing to do, because it's really the first time that one can see how the flame illumination and the light and the natural lighting, even at a very, very late hour here in the day, worked in the ritual bath of Speyer. It's the first time that you can really understand how deep the water of Speyer is. It's 1.90 meters deep, how cold it is, how small people are within this immersion pool. So on the one hand, I find it to be an absolutely necessary element of studying a liturgical space to try and think about the liturgical dynamics. And on the other hand, the distance between the medieval realities and the way that we're, that I play around with videos is absolutely unbridgeable. So I'd love to hear your opinion on that as well. So.
Thank you so much. As someone who works on hydraulics and also has a similar interest from the medieval Islamic perspective, this was fascinating. And I think I will start off with a few questions that I might not be aware of from the Jewish tradition, but they're based on my own observations of water laws within Islamic jurisprudence, and how it is treated there. And so that's kind of where it's sprouting from, to see if there are similarities in the Mishnah and other traditions that formed the basis of these 13th and 12th and 13th century constructions. So the first question I'd like to kind of ask is the water itself. What is amazing about the mikvaot is that they actually combine all four elements: wind, water, with the flame and the fire and the earth together. But in the process, and this is okay, wind and fire don't really have as much to do, but earth and water are both important, it seems, within the tradition. One difference that I know in modern constructions of Islamic ritual baths is that the 64 cubit cubed measurement is can be above the ground. But something that you said that I thought was interesting is that these have to be kind of one with the earth and dug within the earth to be valid. Having asked that question of the connection between earth and water, the first question I'd like to kind of ask in this respect from the philosophical and religious perspective is, what is giving preference to the holiness of this site? The water comes from somewhere else. So is it the earth and the location that is bringing this site its power as a space for washing and avoiding one's sin, or is it more the water itself? Which one is giving more precedence? And if I can couple that with a compound question, like I always do, you did mention the non-human effort as part of bringing the water in. And I know that also in stagnant water or collections of water in medieval Islamic tradition, if the water is muddy or where you cannot see kind of like through it, that makes it not suitable for ablutions. And I'm imagining it's probably the same way. But if the spring water is at a higher level than rainwater, how did they manage the filtration to make those spaces free of the dirt that would have accumulated by coming there with spring water? So they're roughly related, but both having to do with earth and water. And I'll let you kind of answer those to the best. I very long, but yes, please, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It wasn't long at all. I'll try to answer really briefly because they're such huge and lovely topics. I want to talk a lot about it, but I'll hold back. So yes, they have to be dug below ground level. This wasn't always adhered to in every given point in time, but the idea is that they're dug down. And the idea, the most important thing is that there's no vessel. So I don't know if you noticed that the water is really in the walls of the building. It reaches up to the walls of the building itself. There's no tub, there's no sink. And the idea is that anything, this is a 14th century source really explains this and says, if you immerse in a vessel, then you're going to think about things which are finite. But if you manage to immerse in something which doesn't have a vessel, then you can think about the fact that you're in a world not yet created and that you're really at one with everything which is before the creation. So it's a really great source because it kind of gives a sense of the way that going underground kind of draws a line between cosmos and chaos. You can momentarily come into contact with a world not yet created. And water not being collected by human effort. Listen, the Mishnah tractate is a very technical tractate. It doesn't explain the theological conceptions, okay? But if you try and overlap that with different genres of text, look at the biblical quotations regarding living waters as a metaphor for God, and water that kind of has its own power to collect and to move and to spring up and to regenerate itself, okay? It's a very, very strong metaphor. That doesn't come into play within the very kind of legalistic technical explanations of how to collect it. But you get a sense, if you try and kind of read the Mishnah again and again and again and again and again and try to understand the logic, then you see there are 6 degrees of water. That's already in the first Mishnah. And you see the differences between them are exactly what you've just said. Smaller collections within the crevices of rocks are the ones which are most apt to becoming impure, to not being usable. Spring water, which was rainwater of a small volume, is less usable for purification, or for less purifications. The rainwater of a larger volume, which would also be cleaner. And that's less than a spring, but a spring that has been visually contaminated, within which you can see different colors, whose coloration or smell has changed. It's less purifying than a spring with clean waters. I don't know if I've answered your question, but just about the mak, I can tell you that there are loads of questions about how to clean a mikveh and to keep it from becoming ritually unusable.
No, absolutely, and it's that was
Can
the
I add
point.
something?
Yes,
Can I
please.
add?
Yes, please.
In Vaikra, Lamed Vav, which is Leviticus 11, verse 36, it says, "Ach ma'ayan bo umikveh maim yeh tahor," and maim chaim, which means that the water should be always pure and should always be live water, which means circulating water, and that's how they cleaned it. And this is already in the scriptures. So Mishnah came much later. So this is in the scriptures. And while I'm talking, I would like just to have a moment, if I can, to show you a book, Water and Sacred Architecture. This is an edited volume that I have published in last May. And this has 18 chapters of different religions, different places in the whole world, from the Far East to the Middle East, to Europe, to Africa, to Canada and United States. And thank you very much for the lecture. And I'm sorry that you are not included here, because definitely your topic was wonderful, researched, and could be included as a chapter here. But I encourage you to look into it if you are interested in this topic, because the variety of different, as we talked at the beginning, that we want to bring all of us together. So through water and the variety of the different kind of worship around the water, and how water makes the building sacred, and how sacredness of the building makes the water sacred, that were the major questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, your book is definitely going to be included in the edits of my book when it comes back from reviewer comments. I thank you so much. I'm going to read your book with great interest, and I'd love to open this to both of you. Actually, the question I've always battled with the question of whether the mikvaot are sacred spaces. I can't find my own internal definition for which to see them in that way. I do see the idea of the water collecting without human effort to be something which makes it very transcendentally charged, and the idea that the water can be transformative, and all the rules within Leviticus about purifications. I think there's definitely an idea of the potency to make a real measurable change for the individual. For me, I've not found the pegs on which to define the mikvaot as sacred spaces, but I would love both of your opinions if it's okay for me to ask the question.
It depends on how you define sacredness. If you define sacredness as connected to spirituality, definitely the spirit that is around a mikveh and around the act of purification in the water is giving you the sacredness. But if you define sacredness as something that is a ritual, yes, so a mikveh and any kind of rituals that are going with water can be as well sacred. And if you define sacredness in the fact that there are many verses in any kind of Bible, or the Christian Bible, the Quran, or the Jewish Bible, or whatever, or even in Hindu scriptures, you find definitely a lot of verses that are connecting spirituality with the purification act of being in water.
Right. And I'd like to add to that, just because I was thinking about this exactly, is that what makes it a sacred space in relation to water. And if you think about water that most religions consider holy water with apotropaic or mystical properties, and this was why I was asking the connection to the earth question, is that those are basically originating from a place or an earth, or a piece of land, or a piece or a location within the earth that is considered holy. And that's perhaps what makes that water spiritually potent in another way. Here, though, I think the ritual is what is making the place sacred. So the building and the water is not, and has no meaning without the person, and, as you said, the activity and the spirituality of the ritual itself, which makes a slight difference between how we would deem water within another sacred space and as being sacred and apotropaic, and the water here, which is literally meant to absolve sins and wash away one's sins. And so the treatment of the water, the typologies of the water within these places also seems like something that we could investigate and look in further, is that water is not the same, even though it's pure and it's meant for ritualistic purposes, but depending on space and ritual, that's what kind of changes the typology of water within religion.
But water is also, sorry, do you want to say? But water is also mentioned in Genesis in the creation of the world. That is one of the fundamental elements that are mentioned in the beginning of the beginnings. And as such, it's only the only element that it says that God was hovering above it. which means it gave it an uplift to the spiritual act that we are looking into. So if you look at the creation story, water becomes sacred.
Yes.
Definitely.
I do want to agree with your point, but also connect to the idea that water is not just one thing. Within the rabbinic imagination, there are so many different types of water, and water changes under so many circumstances. So I think it's very important what you said about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, and I think that's a very, very, very strong metaphor of the light, at least within the mikvaot. One could take the metaphor of the light over the water to be resounding that idea, especially if you take it with Sefer HaChinuch in a world not yet created, which also uses that quote of the Spirit of God hovering over the water. I think also, for me, it's very interesting, all the situations in which the rabbis explain how the purification practices can go wrong. Now you see so many things can go wrong with the way the water was collected, with the way the building was built, with the way that the building was kept. So you could, part of the cleaning process could make the water unfit by having a measure of drawn water fall back into the mikveh when it was lower than a certain volume. People could prepare themselves wrongly for the ceremony. So if a woman's purification from her bleeding before resuming intimacy with her husband, if she didn't prepare correctly, if she didn't count the days correctly, if she didn't carry out her side of the ceremony in preparation before going into the water or in it, then the purification would be considered not to work. So this maybe is one of the reasons that for me, the definition of a sacred space would only be part of the solution, because as you say, it's a combination between the potency of the water, if it's gone through this filter of having been collected in the right way and kept in the right way, of the people who are carrying out the ceremony, if it's men immersing in their hearts are in the right place, their intentions are in the right place, if it's happening at the right time, if it's happening in the right way, if it's been prepared in the right way. And then also if the building was constructed in a way which follows the guidelines. So I really like it because it's not just like an axis mundi of a place which has an inherent sacrality. And I think maybe this is interesting for you because the seminar works on sacred places, but it's dependent on the spectrum, a lot of which rides on the shoulders of the people who are carrying out the ceremony. It's always extremely fragile, which I like. So.
Definitely. There is a chapter here in the book about a mikveh, that do-it-yourself mikveh. There was a rabbi in the 1930s that his name was Rabbi David Miller in the United States, and he wrote a guideline of how you can actually build a mikveh by yourself in your home. And there was, of course, a lot of discussion about what you're saying, what is forbidden, what is not. Is it kosher? What is it? And so there is a whole discussion about it. It was tried once in Charleston, North Carolina, in a house, but not anymore because the rabbis were against it, of course. I mean, the elite rabbis were against it, but it was tried. Still.
Wow.
So
Yeah,
there are many, many ways, not just medieval mikvot, but also contemporary.
And I guess, may I ask you a question from one of our students, perhaps?
Of course.
So this question of the student is, can you explain the process of the ceremony within the mikvos specifically, and how the building is shaped by it? I guess the verticality of the building. Why is there a need for such verticality? How do individuals then interact with the water when they're immersed in it, and how does the interaction influence the experience? And then to define how they mean interaction, they say interacting with it involves touch. Does this new central element contribute to this symbolic understanding of the ritual and the building?
Wow, I don't know if I remember all of that. I'll begin, but then add whatever I've missed. Okay, so I'll just I'll share my screen just to show a very, very, very standard mikveh. So the short answer is it doesn't need all that depth. Okay, this building, the buildings which you can visit today, which I can visit today, are usually dug about 1.5 meters underground in just a regular. You can walk into quite a standard space. It's not very big. And if we could see all the sides of this room, you'd see that we're seeing kind of 80% of the room. They're usually currently, but also in late antiquity, also in the early modern era, very straightforward spaces, which have to be governed by very strict laws. So as we said, the volume, the water collection, the materials which are allowed to touch the water, the material of the steps, the fact that there's no vessel and that the walls have to be filled, the fact that it's dug underground, the way that the water was led in there, the fact that there shouldn't be any pipes, etc., etc. But the whole aesthetic dynamic of having this very, very, very deep, this very, very deep shaft, it was never done that way except the Middle Ages. So the question that I asked myself is why they need this access, okay? Because what you would need from a point of view of carrying out the rite is just, you can see my cursor, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so what you would need is to have a space where a person's entire attire could be taken off. People have to immerse in the nude, okay? They can't have any sort of differentiation between the water and their bodies. Even if there's a hair on one's body, it has to be taken away. People sometimes take off nail polish. These are obviously not medieval concerns, but the medieval guidelines also talk about interpossession. For example, we have 11th century sources about women who have hair additions, and should they take them off before they have to go into the mikveh, so that there's nothing interposing between the person and the water that's covering the body. There are directions about women putting their arms out in order that the water touches all the parts of their body, but not allowed to touch the walls. So you're not supposed to touch the walls as you're immersing. So people raise their feet and then have all their body hanging within the water. You have to submerge fully with the water covering your head. Some people immerse 3 times, some people 7 times. All the Hebrew sources I know from the Middle Ages talk about 3 immersions. There's a question of when you bless, but the majority of preparations occur ahead of time. So there are pages and pages of preparation about how to make sure that there's nothing interposing, so nothing within one's teeth, nothing within one's ears, nothing within one's belly button. Questions of scabs on the body, should they be taken over? So technical explanations and explanations of how to prepare your body ahead of time. A person, usually these things are gendered, because it was women's purification before the sexual encounter with their husband that was mandated in the Middle Ages, and other purifications, men's purifications or year cycle or life cycle purifications, which were not gendered and not for married women before the marital union. They weren't mandated in the same way, but they had spiritual goals which weren't clear-cut halakha, religious legal necessities. So most of the explanations about how women should prepare themselves, and they're mostly about the moment before they reach the water. So washing in warm water, preparing their hair, preparing their body, etc. And then when they go into the pool, it's really just about standing here, okay, not having any clothes on, walking into the water, making sure water touches the entire body and all the limbs are spread out in a way which the water can reach all the different crevices of the body, and then going out after the blessing. Things could go wrong if she didn't check correctly whether she had really ceased to menstruate 7 days before she goes into the purification. For example, that's something that could make it null. If there wasn't enough volume of water, if it was rainwater, that was something that could make it null. These things had really, really huge ramifications, because it would mean that then the sexual marital encounter would be done not in purification, which would be a huge social issue. It would be a huge religious issue between the couple. So why am I showing this slide? Okay, for your question. So the answer is none of it is necessary. None of it is necessary for the performance. Everything that we're seeing here is something which is beyond the legal necessities, which are spelled out within the religious sources of any genre. Okay, what am I seeing? I'm seeing something which is very much in carrying with the times. So an emphasis on axes, an emphasis on a physical elongation of a ceremonial process, which is part of a transformative ceremony. So I'm seeing a person walking down and walking down and walking down and walking down, and then turning and then walking down, as something which lengthens the period of time of spiritual, emotional, and meditative preparation for the transformative ceremony, but also then lengthens the length of time for a person to reflect upon the transformation that had transpired. So you have a length of time before you reach the water. You have a length of time after you reach the water. I'll go and see if I can show you this Friedberg thing, because you can see so many of us standing there. You can see how huge it is. Just one sec. Okay, here you go. So here you walk down 8 flights of steps into the water. It's a huge body of water, and 8 flights of steps upwards. And as you're walking upwards, you're walking out towards the light. So again, if you're thinking about the metaphors, so many biblical quotes about from the depth I called thee, O God, rising up from one's purification is the trope. Rise up from your purification, rising up from my purification, rising up purified. So these are visually articulated by the buildings, and so much Jewish and Christian culture uses light as a metaphor for God in different contexts, right, not specifically within the context of purification, but these are also things which I'm thinking about. I don't know did I answer the question?
I think so. I mean, that was the way I wanted to hear, but I think yes,
Yes.
that got a lot. And
Thank you so much.
yeah.
Sure. Do you want to ask a follow-up? I kind of, took it to what was interesting to me. I kind of realized I've been going on and on. I'm sorry.
No. It's so interesting about like well, I'm just curious, like you're saying it's about elongating the time of the ritual. What is the necessity of that? Why?
So there's absolutely no necessity, but I think there's a very, very strong spiritual takeaway, because if you think about, for example, take a purification, okay, which I've been working on, which is men's purification before the Day of Atonement. Okay, so it's the highest holiday of the year, arguably, where people are going to try and get atonement from their sins and really clean their slate for the next year. Okay, so giving them time to meditate upon this startup ceremony, which is just before the beginning of this high holiday, giving them time to take stock of the sins that they want to be clean of. And then once they're out of the water, they change into clean white clothes. And then they walk out of this building. And then they're out. And they go back to their house and they visually look different. So I think it gives an experiential sense of transformation.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, and I think my other question was that how does the touch change the experience?
It's very cold. I think it's not every day that people even today, but certainly in the Middle Ages, had water touch their whole body at the same time, especially very deep water. It's not very regular to be naked in a public building. And there's something about the feeling of the last step disappearing under one's feet. The last step is always a huge drop in each of these buildings, like a huge drop, like a 60 centimeter drop. Okay. Yeah. So you're kind of, for a moment, you're just kind of the floor is disappearing under your feet and you're just sinking into the water. So the experience of coming up from the water is a very strong one. And for a second, you're kind of losing control and you're struggling up and then you're out. And the water is very cold when you go into it. It's a stable 4 degree centigrade throughout the year. Oh, thank you for the message. I'll look for your book, and it'll certainly be quoted in my future work. The water is. Sorry.
I have to leave, so sorry, but I enjoyed your lecture very much and the whole
Thank you very
Q&A.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for your questions. And I'll look for your book.
Yeah, we also hope that you do a second volume. So and then invite all of us to publish in that one. So thank you for coming.
I hope that you'll invite me to talk about that book, even though it's an edited volume, but I can present it in a way that you are engaged if you want to continue this topic. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. So just to say about the water, it's very cold when you go in, but then when you come out, you're not cold at all because the insulation of the underground space is thus that the difference between the temperature of the water and the temperature of the air is almost always, even when I was there in January, it's always colder in the water than out, and then you're out and you kind of don't feel cold anymore. And I don't know any of you who've been in very, very cold water, you really feel it's a very strong sense experience. Your body tingles. Scary to go in. It's
something you might want to think about though. And this is not from anything scientific that I've read. It's from this source that I do every morning at my coffee ritual, and it's called Instagram Reels. But they said that one of the only experiences that can create a dopamine rush, I think it is, similar to what some narcotics can do, is actually submersion in cold water.
wow.
Yeah, and the psychological effect of dipping oneself in cold water is actually something that creates a chemical change in the brain. And now that you've said it, I'll look for something proper and cited rather than Instagram and find it and send it your way. But I think that could be an answer why, like the water, because they could have heated the water if they wanted to, as in the 13th and 14th century, I'm assuming.
They could have. I mean, I mean, this is a whole new thing, and we have like 2 minutes. So I don't want to go down my rant about the heating of the water, but I think it's definitely a choice. These pools, the one that you saw the video in Speyer, it's at least 12 times bigger than the pool has to be. Okay, so it's a choice. It's a choice for the size of pool. It's a choice for the size of access. It's a choice for all that quarried stone down in there. There's so much masonry in those buildings. It's a huge cost. It's a huge effort. And I think the cold water was absolutely a choice, okay? Especially as the preparations are in heated water. And we know from the medieval sources, it says, Maim Chamim, heated water. You have to prepare in heated water, then you go into this cold water. And I'm sure that what you're saying has an element of it. My cousin, who's kind of young 20-year-old person, he does all these ice baths. It's young people are so excited about it because it does work on a physical level. And I think we know enough about the 12th century to know that they were doing so many things which were working on a physical penitential level in order to have some physical experience with it. A physical means for reaching a spiritual goal, which is based on a heightened sensual experience. Sensual just in the meaning of working on your senses, on your body. I think for me, this is really fascinating because I think you can really see it also in Christian society.
Well,
so interesting.
That question on dopamine rushes and we're now leaving with the great happy dopamine rush. Thank you, Dr. Neta Bodner, for taking the time and really explaining this ritual and these amazing medieval buildings to us, and the element of water, and this idea of submerging into the water, cleansing your sins, and then walking up and seeing the light. I think the imagery and the videos that you showed us really encapsulate the experience much better than just a static image. So thank you for all that you've done in your research. I look forward to the monograph. And again, on behalf of Faiths and Cultures in Conversation, and also the University of Texas at Dallas and the Harry W. Bass Jr. School of Arts, Humanities, and Technology, we'd like to thank you very, very much for this conversation and for giving us a lot to think about in terms of purifying the soul and the relationship between the elements and human nature, and how for centuries and millennia different religions and different cultures have answered this question of hygiene, purification, and spiritual purification in terms of ritual. And I think that it opens up a dialogue in so many different ways. And that is the point of these meetings and these academic discussions. So thank you, and thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for giving me 2 hours to think about the beauty of human spirit, and for the beautiful explanation about everything that you do. I think being able to learn about different religions, and I wish I was here to learn rather than to speak, because I think it's just at the base of all religions is the beauty of human spirit and a wish to make a future that's better than the today. And it's so amazing that you have these interfaith discussions. I really hope to learn more from you in the future.
And we hope to have you here, since I didn't know that you liked the Kimball that much. One of our professors at UT Dallas left a comment that the landscape architect of UT Dallas was Peter Walker, and that Tadao Ando did the Fourth Ward Modern.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was there. I couldn't leave. I didn't need any of the art. The building was the art itself. It just like literally needed nothing in there. The Tadao Ando building. It's also a water building.
We hope to bring you back again and create a new water feature for you to enjoy next time.
Oh, thank you. And I'm seeing now in the chat, yes, this act of purification is still practiced by Jewish community, by men before holidays, by women with this issue of bleeding. Thank you, Fairuz, for your message. I'm a huge fan of the poet Fairuz. So
Wonderful.
I like your name, and thank you very, 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 very much. And I hope we get to see each other in person in a better world that learns from the microcosm of what you guys do.
Thank you, Dr. Bodner.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For that.
That will sum up our session, and we wish everybody a good day and wish you a good evening. Thank you for staying up so late at night. Thank you.